The rain fell harder as Ryan stood frozen, staring at the stranger who knelt before his wife's grave. The man clutched a small girl's hand, tears streaming down his face as he whispered words that made Ryan's blood run cold. It was my wife's grave. How could two men claim the same woman? Before we continue, hit subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Ryan Garcia had built his empire from rubble and ruin, turning a single construction company into a network of high-rises that pierced the sky across 3 continents. At 63, his hands were softer than they'd been at 20, but the calluses on his soul remained. Money had a way of smoothing surfaces while leaving the depths untouched. He drove himself to the cemetery every Sunday. The roads were familiar now, worn into his muscle memory like the verses of a song he'd learned as a child. His driver had offered countless times, but Ryan refused. Some journeys demanded solitude. The black Mercedes moved through the gray morning with the silence of a confession booth, carrying its burden of grief and guilt-edged memories. Christine's grave sat beneath an oak tree that had witnessed 40 springs. He'd chosen this spot because she'd loved trees, loved the way their branches created cathedrals of light and shadow. The headstone was simple: Christine Garcia, beloved wife, 1962-2019, because she'd hated ostentation, had rolled her eyes at the marble fountains and gold fixtures he'd wanted to install in their home. "You can't take it with you," she'd said, her hand on his cheek, her smile soft as morning light. He'd learned that lesson too late. The rain began as a whisper, then grew insistent. Ryan stood under his umbrella, watching water pool in the carved letters of her name. He'd brought white roses, her favorite, though she'd always scolded him for the expense. That's when he saw them. A man knelt at the grave next to Christine's, his shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to tear themselves from somewhere deep and desperate. A little girl stood beside him, perhaps 6 or 7, her hand resting on his shoulder with the ancient wisdom that children sometimes carry. She wore a yellow raincoat that was 2 sizes too large, the sleeves rolled up in clumsy folds. Ryan looked away, granting them privacy. Grief was a private country, its borders fiercely guarded. But the man's voice carried across the wet grass. "I'm sorry, Emily. I'm so sorry I couldn't save you." Ryan's heart stuttered. Emily, Christine's middle name. The coincidence settled in his chest like a stone dropped in still water. He tried to ignore it, tried to focus on his own ritual of remembrance, but the man's grief was a living thing, raw and wounded, and it called to something in Ryan that he'd thought long buried. The little girl spoke, her voice clear as a bell. "Daddy, Mommy wouldn't want you to be sad. I know, sweetheart. I know." Ryan turned then, unable to stop himself. The man was younger, perhaps 40, with the kind of lean frame that spoke of missed meals and sleepless nights. His clothes were clean, but worn, his shoes practical rather than fashionable. The girl looked up at Ryan with eyes that seemed too old for her small face. "I'm sorry," Ryan said, the words automatic. "I didn't mean to intrude." The man wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "No, we're the ones who should apologize. Kyle Connor." He offered his hand, and Ryan shook it, feeling the roughness of manual labor against his palm. "Ryan Garcia." Recognition flickered across Kyle's face, quick as lightning, then disappeared behind a mask of polite neutrality. Everyone knew Ryan Garcia. His face had graced magazine covers, business sections, charity galas. Fame was a currency he'd never wanted, but couldn't spend away. "This is my daughter, Bonnie," Kyle said, and the girl stepped forward with a solemnity that made Ryan's throat tight. "Hello, Mr. Garcia," she said, and her manners were so careful, so practiced, that Ryan wondered what other adult responsibilities this child carried. They stood in awkward silence. 3 strangers bound by grief and rain. Ryan should have left, Should have returned to his car, his empty house, his empire of steel and glass. But something held him there, something in the way Kyle looked at the grave with such desperate longing. "Your wife?" Ryan asked, gesturing to the headstone that sat beside Christine's. Kyle nodded. "Emily Connor. She died 2 years ago." The name punched through Ryan like a fist. He turned to look at the grave he'd passed 100 times without really seeing. Emily Marie Connor, 1983-2021. Beloved wife and mother. But that wasn't possible. That wasn't. His eyes moved back to Christine's grave, then to Emily's, then back again. The plots were adjacent, separated by perhaps 2 feet of grass and earth. He'd chosen this spot. He'd purchased it. "I don't understand," Ryan said, his voice rough. "This plot. I bought this plot from my wife 5 years ago." Kyle's face went pale. "No, that's not right. I bought this plot for Emily 3 years ago, before she passed." The rain fell harder, drumming against umbrellas and headstones with increasing urgency. Bonnie pressed closer to her father, her small hand gripping his coat. "There must be some mistake," Ryan said, but even as he spoke, doubt crept in like fog. He'd been so devastated when Christine died, so broken by the sudden violence of the aneurysm that had stolen her from him between one breath and the next. The funeral arrangements had passed in a blur of papers and decisions made through the thick fog of grief. "I have the deed," Kyle said. "At home. The cemetery sold me this plot when Emily got sick." She wanted to be buried under a tree. Christine had wanted the same thing. The coincidence was too large, too strange. Ryan pulled out his phone, hands shaking. He scrolled through documents, through the careful digital filing system his assistant had created. The deed was there, dated 5 years ago, the plot clearly marked. But when Kyle pulled out his own phone, his deed was there too, dated 3 years ago. The same plot number staring back at them like an accusation. "This isn't possible," Ryan whispered. Bonnie tugged on her father's sleeve. "Daddy, what's wrong?" "Nothing, sweetheart. Just a mix-up." But Kyle's voice was tight with something that wasn't quite anger, wasn't quite fear. "We should go to the cemetery office," Ryan nodded. "Monday. First thing." They stood there. 2 men who'd buried their hearts in the same piece of earth, while the rain washed away any certainty they might have held. But something else nagged at Ryan, something he couldn't quite name. The way Kyle had said his wife's name, the catch in his voice when he'd spoken of saving her. "How did she die?" Ryan asked, then immediately regretted the intrusion. "I'm sorry. That's none of my—" "Cancer," Kyle said simply. "Breast cancer. Stage 4 by the time they found it. She fought for 2 years, but—" He looked down at Bonnie, smoothing her wet hair with a tenderness that made Ryan ache. She was brave until the very end. Christine had died instantly. No time for goodbyes, no time for final words. Ryan had envied those who got to say goodbye, had hated himself for the envy. "My wife had an aneurysm," he said. "She was making breakfast. She just fell." Kyle's eyes held understanding, the kind that only comes from standing in the same darkness. "I'm sorry." They exchanged phone numbers with the awkwardness of men who'd stumbled into intimacy too quickly. As Ryan walked back to his car, he turned once to see Kyle and Bonnie still standing at the grave, the man's hand on the small girl's shoulder, both of them silhouetted against the gray sky. Something was wrong, something beyond the administrative error, beyond the confusion of deeds and dates. Ryan had built his fortune on instinct, on the ability to see patterns where others saw chaos, and this pattern made no sense at all. Monday morning arrived wrapped in cold clarity. Ryan sat in the cemetery office across from a nervous administrator named Mr. Peterson, whose hands fluttered like trapped birds as he examined the documents spread across his desk. This is unprecedented, Peterson said, his voice thin. We have rigorous systems in place, double-checking, triple-checking. This shouldn't be possible. But it was possible, because it had happened. Kyle arrived 20 minutes later, Bonnie in tow because, as he explained with quiet exhaustion, her school had a teacher training day. The girl sat in a corner chair, coloring in a book with fierce concentration, while the adults tried to untangle the impossible. The truth emerged slowly, painfully. There had been an error, a single, catastrophic error in the cemetery's record-keeping system during a software migration 5 years ago. Plot numbers had been duplicated, sold twice. Ryan's purchase had been recorded, but when the system was updated, the same plot number had been assigned again. The grave next to your wife's, Peterson said to Ryan, his face gray with professional mortification. That was supposed to be your plot, but it was recorded incorrectly. Ryan felt the ground shift beneath him. So, Christine is in the correct location, according to your original deed. But Mr. Connor purchased what he believed was the adjacent plot, and Peterson's voice failed him. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the scratch of Bonnie's crayons against paper. Are you saying my wife isn't buried where I thought she was? Kyle's voice was dangerously quiet. No, Peterson said quickly. Your wife is exactly where you buried her. But Mr. Garcia's wife, according to the original deed, she should have been in the plot where we currently have recorded as empty space. Ryan's mind raced. But I've been visiting her grave for 5 years. The headstone, the location, everything. The headstone was placed correctly according to the paperwork at the time, Peterson said. But the paperwork was wrong. The implications crashed over them like a wave. Somewhere in the labyrinth of administrative incompetence, 2 graves had been confused. 2 widowers had been worshipping at shrines that might not hold what they believed. We need to verify, Ryan said, his voice steel. We need to know for certain who is buried where. Peterson's face went, if possible, paler. That would require exhumation. The legal process alone would take months, and the cost, I don't care about the cost, Ryan said. I care about my wife. Kyle stood abruptly, startling Bonnie, who looked up from her coloring. No, I can't. I can't do that to Emily. I can't disturb her. She's at peace. But what if it's not her? Ryan asked, and the question hung in the air like smoke. It is her. I was there. I watched them lower the casket. I threw the first handful of dirt. It was her. So did I, Ryan said. I did all of that too. But if the plots were mixed up. Kyle's face crumpled. He sat back down heavily, his hands covering his face. Bonnie abandoned her coloring and went to him, wrapping her small arms around his neck. It's okay, Daddy, she whispered. It's okay. But it wasn't okay, and they all knew it. The coffee shop was neutral territory, chosen because neither man could bear to sit in the cemetery office any longer. Bonnie sat between them in the booth, working her way through a hot chocolate with an intensity that suggested she was trying very hard not to listen to the adult conversation happening around her. Tell me about Emily, Ryan said, because he needed to understand, needed to piece together the puzzle that made no sense. Kyle's eyes grew distant. She was a nurse, pediatric oncology. She spent her days with dying children and somehow never lost her smile. He paused, stirring his coffee with mechanical precision. We met in a hospital. I was there visiting my mother, and Emily was working a double shift. She spilled coffee on my shoes and apologized so profusely that I asked her to dinner just to make her stop. The story was tender, worn smooth by repeated telling, a touchstone of grief. She wanted children so badly, Kyle continued. It took us years, fertility treatments, disappointments, hope that kept getting crushed. Then Bonnie came. He looked at his daughter with such fierce love that Ryan had to look away. Emily had 2 years with her before the diagnosis, 2 years of being the mother she'd dreamed of being. Ryan thought of Christine, of their decision not to have children. She'd been ambivalent, and he'd been too focused on building his empire. Another regret to add to the mountain. Did she work at St. Mary's? Ryan asked, the question emerging from some instinct he couldn't name. Kyle's head snapped up. Yes. How did you? My wife volunteered there, at the children's wing. The words came slowly as memory surfaced. She started going there after we decided not to have kids. She said it fulfilled something in her. They stared at each other across the table, a new possibility taking shape between them. They might have known each other, Kyle said. They might have been friends. The thought was absurd, and yet somehow inevitable. The coincidences were piling up too high, too neat. Adjacent graves, the same middle name, the same hospital, the same love of trees and children. Bonnie looked up from her hot chocolate, her upper lip decorated with a brown mustache. Mommy had a friend named Christine. She talked about her sometimes. The world tilted. Ryan's vision narrowed to a pinpoint, then expanded again, everything sharp and too bright. What did she say about her? His voice was barely a whisper. That she was kind. That she told good stories. That she... Bonnie's face scrunched with the effort of remembering. That she understood. Kyle was pale. Emily did mention someone, a volunteer she'd gotten close to, but she never... I never made the connection. Ryan pulled out his phone, scrolling through photos with shaking hands. He found one of Christine at the hospital, taken by a staff member during a Christmas party. She was laughing, surrounded by children, her joy incandescent. He showed it to Bonnie. Is this the Christine your mommy talked about? The girl studied the photo with careful attention. I think so. She has nice eyes. Had nice eyes, Ryan wanted to correct, but didn't. The revelation came not in the cemetery office or the coffee shop, but in Kyle's small apartment 3 days later. Ryan had been invited to see photos, to help piece together the friendship between their wives, to understand the connection that had somehow tied their griefs together. The apartment was cramped, but clean, filled with evidence of a life lived on the edge of making it work. Bonnie's drawings covered the refrigerator, bills were stacked neatly on the counter, and everything spoke of a man who was doing his best with what he had. Kyle pulled out photo albums, the old-fashioned kind with plastic sleeves and handwritten dates. Emily smiled out from hundreds of moments, birthdays, holidays, ordinary Tuesdays made extraordinary by love. And there, tucked into the pages like pressed flowers, were photos of Emily with another woman, Christine. Ryan's hands trembled as he touched the images. Christine at a hospital fundraiser, Emily beside her, both of them laughing. Christine holding a child in her arms, Emily adjusting the IV stand, their partnership evident. Christine and Emily at what looked like a coffee shop, heads bent together in conversation. They had been friends, close friends. I don't understand, Kyle said. Why wouldn't Emily have mentioned your name? If she knew Christine was married to Ryan Garcia, she would have... Christine kept her maiden name, Ryan said absently, still staring at the photos. For professional purposes. She was Christine Whitmore at the hospital. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed made no sense. Then Bonnie spoke from where she sat on the floor, sorting through her toys. Mommy said Christine was sleeping there. Both men turned to her. What did you say, sweetheart? Kyle asked. Mommy. Before she went to heaven. She said her friend Christine was sleeping under the tree, and she wanted to sleep there too, with her friend. The silence stretched like taffy, thin and ready to break. Ryan's mind raced backward, to the day he'd purchased the plots. He'd been so destroyed by grief that his assistant had handled most of the arrangements. But he remembered choosing the spot under the oak tree, remembered thinking Christine would have loved it. Except he hadn't been the one to suggest it. His assistant had. And his assistant had been. He struggled to remember. Had been someone Christine had recommended. Someone she'd trusted. Someone from the hospital volunteer program. Emily worked in administration part-time, Kyle said slowly, his face going white, to help pay the medical bills. She had access to the hospital volunteer records, Ryan finished. The truth crashed over them like a tsunami, drowning everything in its path. Christine and Emily hadn't just been friends. They'd been best friends, close as sisters, confidants who'd shared their deepest fears and hopes. When Emily had been diagnosed, when she'd known she was dying, she'd made a plan. She'd wanted to be buried next to her friend. But Christine had died first, suddenly, without warning. And Emily, in her grief, in her desire to be close to the friend who'd understood her, who'd shared her pain, had done something extraordinary. She'd arranged it. She'd used her hospital connections to find out where Christine was being buried. She'd used her administrative access to manipulate the cemetery records. She'd created the duplicate plot number, had ensured that when her time came, she would be laid to rest beside the woman who'd been her anchor in the storm. The system error wasn't an error, Ryan said, his voice hollow. It was deliberate. Kyle's face was a mask of shock and understanding, and something that might have been pride. She never told me. She never said. Christine never told me either, Ryan said. About Emily, about the hospital, about any of it. She kept her volunteer work separate from our life. She said it was her own thing, something just for her. They'd both been married to women with secrets, but they were secrets born of love, not deception. Christine and Emily had created their own world within the world, had built a friendship that transcended the boundaries of their separate lives. And in death, Emily had refused to let that friendship end. The cemetery hadn't made a mistake. There was no administrative error, no software glitch. There was only a dying woman's desperate wish to rest beside the person who'd made her feel less alone. Bonnie looked between the two men, her young face creased with worry. "Are you mad at Mommy?" Kyle gathered her into his arms, his eyes bright with tears. "No, sweetheart. I'm not mad. I'm sad that she felt like she couldn't tell me." Ryan felt something break open in his chest, some calcified shell of grief cracking to reveal the soft, wounded tissue beneath. He'd been angry at Christine for dying, angry at himself for not appreciating her enough, angry at the universe for its casual cruelty. But this revelation that she'd had a whole friendship, a whole part of her life that he'd never known about, this was different. This was evidence that she'd been her own person, with her own needs and relationships and desires. He'd loved her, but he hadn't known her. Not really. Not all of her. "The plots should stay as they are," he said finally. Emily wanted to be beside Christine. That's where she should be. Kyle's eyes widened. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." Ryan looked at the photos again, at his wife's smile as she stood beside her friend, both of them unaware that death was already reaching for them. They chose each other in life. They should have that choice, honored in death. The rain had stopped by the time Ryan returned to the cemetery the following Sunday. The oak tree's branches were bright with new leaves, and the graves beneath it seemed somehow less lonely than they had before. He placed white roses on Christine's headstone. Then, after a moment's hesitation, placed a second bouquet on Emily's. Kyle and Bonnie arrived as the sun broke through the clouds. They'd brought flowers too, yellow daisies for Emily, white tulips for Christine. "She would have liked that you're here," Kyle said. "Emily always said loneliness was the worst part of dying." "Christine felt that way too," Ryan replied. "I just never knew it." They stood together in comfortable silence, two widowers and one small girl, keeping vigil over the friends who'd found each other in life and refused to part in death. Bonnie took Ryan's hand, her grip small and warm. "They're together now," she said, with the certainty of childhood faith. "They're not lonely anymore." Ryan looked down at her, this child who'd lost her mother too young, who'd learned to carry grief with grace. "No," he agreed. "They're not lonely anymore." As they walked away together, Ryan felt something shift in his chest. The grief remained. It would always remain. But it was joined now by something else. Gratitude. Connection. The understanding that love was larger than he'd imagined, that it could stretch across lives and deaths, and the spaces between them. Christine had kept her friendship with Emily private, not because she was hiding something, but because she'd needed something that was wholly hers, separate from his money and influence, and the weight of his name. She'd needed a friend who saw her as just Christine, not as Mrs. Garcia, not as the billionaire's wife. And she'd found that in Emily, in quiet moments at the hospital, in conversations over coffee, in the shared understanding of women who'd chosen their paths and lived with both the joy and sorrow those choices brought. The following week, Ryan established a scholarship fund in both women's names, the Christine and Emily Friendship Fund, supporting pediatric oncology nurses and hospital volunteers. Kyle helped design the program, and Bonnie drew the logo, 2 trees with intertwined branches, sheltering a flock of birds. They met at the cemetery every Sunday after that, sometimes talking, sometimes silent, always leaving flowers on both graves. Ryan began to learn about the man his wife had called friend, and in learning about Emily, he learned new things about Christine. She'd been braver than he'd known, kinder, more complete in herself than he'd ever understood, and she'd chosen a resting place not just under a tree she loved, but beside a friend who'd loved her back in a quiet plot of earth that had become, through will and longing and Emily's desperate manipulation of fate, exactly what both women had needed, a place where no one had to be alone,